When you think about the kind of dynamics of instability and authoritarian regime, they're often these kind of cascading events. And so the fact that people are coming out onto the streets in a highly repressive regime is an informative signal to other Russians that people share their views. So I don't think it's something to be overlooked.
Welcome and thank you for joining today's special edition of Teneo Insights. I'm Kevin Kajiwara with Teneo Political Risk Advisory in New York City. Well, as we all know, after months of planning and after months of warning, frankly, Russia commenced its invasion of Ukraine on Wednesday night, following President Putin's angry, historically inaccurate, and intermittently coherent speech on Monday. So as we digest the shock of the biggest military action in Europe since World War II, we wanted to take stock here this morning ahead of this weekend for, I think, beyond the needless and unjustified suffering of the Ukrainian people. What we're really talking about here is the single biggest test of the post-war world order. And quite frankly, at the moment, it looks like we're kind of giving up on it a bit and ceding Ukraine. And those who are going to suffer the most are definitely going to be the Ukrainian people. And it is, it's a big test upon which the global economy has been based for now over 70 years. So I'm joined today by colleagues both from Teneo and from our partners at WestExec Advisors. And I'm going to do away with our traditional introductions of everybody because I've got so many people on, and I'll intro them as we move through the conversation. So I want to start with our two colleagues from WestExec. Andrea Kendall-Taylor, she's a senior advisor at WestExec Advisors. She is a former deputy national intelligence officer for Russia and Eurasia at the National Intelligence Council and was at the CIA, and she's now a senior fellow at the Center for a New American Security. Jim Townsend is also at CNAS, and he also is a senior advisor to WestExec and is a former Deputy Secretary of Defense for European and NATO policy. So I'm wondering, Andrea and Jim, if you can maybe just give us a start here and give us your understanding of the state of the war right now. Obviously, there's a lot of news out there. There's a lot of propaganda from both sides. We see the dramatic pictures on TV kind of on endless loop, but it's very difficult to get a sense of, what the current state of Russia's advance is and the current state of Ukraine's defense actually is. And this comes as just moments ago, there seems to be some news that Putin is suggesting having talks in at a neutral site. But where are we this morning? And maybe, Andrea, we can start with you.
Sure, Kevin, thanks for having us. And I am just going to reiterate how hard I think it is to know exactly what's happening. There's a lot of information swirling on all sides of the equation, and especially when it comes to trying to determine what's happening in Ukraine in terms of Russian advances and how well the Ukrainians are doing. I think it's really hard to tell. But maybe just to step back very briefly, we all had looked at Putin's recognition of Luhansk and Donetsk and wondered what that was all about. Some people were hoping that would, that was the end plan, that was the game plan, but it's obviously painfully clear that that was just the first step, and yet not a first step, but another step towards a much broader confrontation with Ukraine. And within, a day or so of that happening, the war has kicked off. As expected, the Russian military opened its campaign with airstrikes targeting command and control systems. They're going after logistical systems. Logistical centers, airports, Ukrainian air defenses, and other critical infrastructure. There is some reporting out there, including from the UK Ministry of Defense, suggesting that Russia may have fallen short of its first day objectives. A lot of reports maybe that Russia has faced greater resistance from Ukraine than anticipated. When I talk to colleagues of mine, though, who are Russian military analysts, I think they have somewhat of a different view. and say, that Russia really has made fairly significant, meaningful gains into Ukrainian territory, and this is unfolding quite, just about the way that they had expected it. So, I don't have a definitive answer exactly what's happening in the back and forth. It's so hard to tell with mixed reporting. We obviously know that Kyiv is under attack today. We're hearing U.S. intelligence reporting that the capital could fall within 2 to 4 days. I think it's fair to say that Russia's priority, its goal remains to decapitate the Zelensky government and install a puppet regime there. But I don't think anyone could really rule out the possibility that Russia would be looking to partition Ukraine, and that could include territory to the west of the river. There have been stories about, maps up on Russian state media looking at parts of Ukraine that were kind of given away by Soviet leaders, by Russian imperial leaders, and that does include territory that's significantly to the west of the river. And so given everything that we've heard Putin say, in terms of, Ukraine doesn't have a right to exist, I think we can't rule out that we would be looking at a longer term kind of occupation or partition of Ukraine. But again, really hard to say exactly what Russia's end goal is here, because both of those options, installing a puppet regime and making it last and work and function, is costly, as is holding large swaths of Ukrainian territory over a prolonged period of time. So it's really, I think we're all, I don't think anyone necessarily knows what the end game is. You mentioned, can maybe wrap with this really quickly. You mentioned the negotiations. That was something that Zelensky brought up. He offered to sit down with the Russians in order to stop the fighting. Russia looks ready to do that. But I think, I'm not optimistic that those negotiations would produce anything. And I think it's just as likely that this is a Russian effort to make Ukrainians worry that Zelensky is going to capitulate, which could weaken him domestically. So at this point, duration is also hard to tell. That they probably hope that the Ukrainians are probably hoping that the protests in Russia, which I think are meaningful, and the tough sanctions are going to increase pressure on Putin to negotiate.
Yeah, I want to get back to that point here in a minute, but would like to bring in Jim and see if you're hearing anything in addition to what Andrea laid out on either the condition on the ground in Ukraine or with regards to the potential for some talks.
Well, thank you very much. And I associate completely with what Andrea had to say as we try to pierce the murk of what's happening, and just to really underline that my experience in dealing with so many conflicts, although certainly nothing along this scale, is that these opening days are not only are they hard to penetrate, but political measures, statements, whether coming from Moscow or from Zelensky or whatever, what matters is on the battlefield. Personally, I don't see Putin sitting down with Zelensky and at all. I think he feels that within his grasp is taking his first priority, which is Ukraine. And I think he feels that is in the offing, and that's where he wants to go. It's sitting with Putin, and sitting with Zelensky and talking about some type of compromise. Just that's not part of it. First thing. Second thing is one thing that I've been a little heartened by, but it's frankly at the end of the day will be tragic, is just what right now they are beginning to hand out machine guns. There was a video of machine guns being handed out in Kyiv to civilians. There's a general mobilization. There's a lot of effort being made by the civilian population to fight. And while we honor that and just cannot believe the bravery of it, it shows you how desperate the situation is. And I think while we're going to see some real acts of heroism in the days ahead as they try to make this painful for the Russians, at the end of the day, it's just going to add to the tragedy of casualties and destruction that will not lead to Putin withdrawing his forces. That's going to be painful for him, but stopping Putin at this point militarily is going to be just a miracle if something like that were to happen, and I don't see that. But what it does tell you, though, is the coming weeks and months, you could see a insurgency of some type taking place that will make it very hard for Russia to hold Ukraine, if you will. If his idea is that he's going to take the entire nation, and he's going to bring in the National Guard, he's going to bring in Chechens, as you might have seen Chechens coming in, to actually try to hold Ukraine as they put in a puppet government and solidify political control. I don't think they're going to be able to do that in peaceful circumstances. I think we're seeing among the Ukraine people, in fact, this spirit to fight back, and that's going to put pressure on Putin to try to figure out, so where does he go from here in terms of an occupation, in terms of what he has to do to suppress an insurgency, and how that will certainly bring pressure from the West down on him very hard as we see more and more brutal scenes unfold in the coming months. If this were to be a lightning strike, if this was to have toppled Kyiv and brought an end to the fighting in the next couple of weeks, that's one thing. But I think we're starting to see that this may not be the case. And therefore, more pressure on Putin and more pressure on the West to do something about that. Do we support insurgents? Do we run that risk? Do we run the risk of retaliation by the Russians who might see the West resupplying insurgents operating out of Poland or something like that, where the Russians then retaliate against Poland, for hosting a supply line to insurgents? It makes this even more complicated. So I guess what I want to emphasize here is that this is going to go on for a long time, and is not clear what the end game is going to look like. What does victory look like for Putin? And I will also end by saying the unity in the West is not only stronger than I thought we would see, but as it gets more and more brutal on the one hand, and the spirit of the Ukrainians becomes more and more evident, and the acts of heroism inspiring to the West, that will make the West more cohesive in terms of putting pressure on Putin and trying to do something more in terms of dealing with Putin. And so that's really important, because there was a fear that over time that unity would begin to break up a bit, because there's going to be impact on the European economy and on gas and this type of thing that will cause political problems in European capitals. But the longer we see these brutal pictures, and the longer we see a Ukraine that's fighting, that's going to keep us together as a transatlantic community and put pressure, frankly, on the Western governments to go and do something more than just providing the kinds of sanctions we're seeing now.
Okay, so I want to unpack some of that. Thank you, Jim. And I want to look again at some of the objectives as this battle plays out. And I want to bring in my colleague Andreas Tursa as well here. He's our Central and Eastern European advisor, and he's on the line today from Vilnius, Lithuania. And you won't be able to see his picture, unfortunately. But Andreas, as Andrea pointed out, this kind of decapitation and replacement, either via some sort of surrender or via defeat, seems to be the main objective here. But I guess the question that both Andrea and Jim kind of raise is the "and then what" element of this. Once they've broken it and they've bought it, where do you think? What are you thinking on that front right now, Andreas?
Thank you, Kevin. Yes, I agree with the points made by Andrea and Jim earlier. It's definitely not not easy to know Russia's end objective. But yes, I completely agree that the near-term objective is to install a more compliant government in Kiev by forcing the current administration of Zelensky to surrender or removing it by force. Then I think in the medium term, once this new more compliant administration is in place, I think Moscow would likely seek to sign a new legally binding agreement with Kiev, which I would expect to address Russia's key demands outlined earlier. That is demilitarization of Ukraine, agreement that Ukraine never joins NATO, force Ukraine to recognize Crimea as Russian sovereign territory, and perhaps settle the conflict with the so-called LPR, DPR republics in the Donbass, potentially demanding the recognition of their independence as well. And, given the advantage the Russian armed forces hold, I think unfortunately, it's a matter of time before we're going to see this objective being realized. The timeline of how soon this is going to happen, of course, it's very difficult to predict. But at the same time, we have to acknowledge that in the second day of Russia's invasion, we are already seeing their forces deep in the capital, Kiev. And, I'm just watching a few signposts of how long this is going to last. And the first one is really critical one, is the control over critical infrastructure around Kiev, and particularly the airports, which could be then used to fly in thousands of Russian troops if Russians take over these facilities. Also, as mentioned already today, I'm watching the level of local resistance, particularly in Kiev. There is a very strong anti-Russian sentiment. A large number of weapons are being distributed to the general population, newly formed defense units. And I think this potentially strong resistance from the local population in an urban setting is definitely a risk for Putin. It could, draw them into protracted battles that are costly. That would mean greater losses for Russia, more information, graphic images about the consequences of Russia's actions in Ukraine reaching Russia's general populations. We've already seen protests, although small scale, but still in Russia. That would lead to greater international condemnation and potentially further tightening of sanctions on his regime. So this is definitely something to watch. And I guess as a final point, yes, I think any puppet government would be seen as illegitimate by the Russian population, by the Ukrainian population. Therefore, it would be extremely difficult for it to make the country functional, from an economic or political perspective. At the same time, I think this puppet government controlled by Moscow does not necessarily have to be a permanent solution. It could be a temporary one, and Ukraine that is weak, that is unstable, that is divided, really could be useful for Moscow, in helping it to maintain and increase its leverage over the country over a longer term. So these are my main. Yep.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I want to turn to something that Andrea brought up earlier and get maybe her additional comments on this, and yours as well, Andreas. And that is, what do we know about the state of the Russian people on this? You pointed out, Andrea, that, and we've seen the pictures of some of these protests, which I think, as usual, seem to be pretty limited to Moscow and St. Petersburg. But nonetheless, people know that they are going to get arrested, and they know that that's probably not going to be a particularly good experience, I suspect. And yet 1,700 people were arrested last night. Do we or should we read anything into that? Is that significant?
I think it is significant. So I'm actually working on something on this right now, and I've spent a lot of time looking at authoritarian regimes and political stability. Baseline is it's unlikely to destabilize Putin in the near term, in large part because of the high repression, right? The costs to collective action are so high, the detainment, all of those people. He has the backing of the security services. There's all sorts of reasons why I think Putin himself really believes that he'll be able to manage any kind of backlash that might stem from this conflict. But that said, the other thing we do know about authoritarian regimes that they look very strong and stable right up to the very moment that they're not. And I think your point, Kevin, about the fact that people are still showing up to protest, it was actually more than 53 Russian cities that saw protests yesterday. Okay. So there is some geographic spread, which is also notable when you understand kind of how protests can unseat an authoritarian regime. Having that geographic diversity is also important. So I don't think it's something just to ignore. I think, we've all been talking about how this has been such a clarifying moment that we all now see the Putin regime in a totally new way. I think that's true for Russians too. I spent a lot of time talking to Russians, opposition figures, people who would be inclined to disagree with President Putin, who were absolutely convinced that Russia would not go to war, that Putin would not engage in this war of aggression. Sure, they would concede, they would kind of strangle Ukraine economically, try to extract concessions, but it was really like unfathomable that he would initiate this conflict. And so it is possible when you think about the kind of dynamics of instability in authoritarian regime, there are often these kind of cascading events. And so the fact that people are coming out onto the streets in a highly repressive regime is an informative signal to other Russians that people share their views. So I don't think it's something to be overlooked. Again, I think that's the less likely scenario, that this would actually prompt instability inside Russia, but I don't think we should discount it entirely either.
So I know you've got a hard stop here in just a few minutes. So I want to maximize my time with you here, and I want to ask you one last kind of question, because you've been following Russia and you've been following Putin for a very long time. So, you know, when you saw the speech on Monday night, and when you saw that sort of bizarre Security Council meeting where he kind of humiliated some of his, I mean, what did you take away from this? And, you know, I know there's been speculation on everything from his health to whether he's unhinged, he's been way too isolated, et cetera, et cetera. But are there any key takeaways you have from that? And by the way, the President Macron of France and the French delegation have also talked about, after having spent a lot of time with him at the end of that long table, that things were sort of different seeming. And I guess, so that's my first question to you. And the second question is for you and Jim, which is, did you take his statement, the threat to outsiders participating in this sort of like the retaliation will be unlike anything ever seen before? Did you read that? Did NATO read that? Does the United States read that as a distinct nuclear threat?
Maybe I can take the first one, Jim. You can take the second one. I'm not a doctor, I'm not a psychologist, so I can't really speak to like his exact state of mind. I don't think anyone can, but I think the thing that's so concerning is really the point you made, Kevin, about his isolation, and also about the fact that there seems to be now no one within his inner circle who can really constrain him. And so the dressing down of even the head of his security services just shows you that it really is, I think, the decision of a single individual. And there's all sorts of political science research that talks about how personalist regimes are the most aggressive, the most likely initiate wars against democracies, all of these things. I mean, this now to me seems like an extreme form of personalism, and that is extremely dangerous. So I think, and he's laid out, you know, Putin obviously lies all the time, but there are occasions, thinking of his Munich 2007 speech, I think this last speech that he gave, where he very clearly telegraphs and tells the world exactly what he thinks and where he's going. I thought that speech was that. And so I think he laid it all out there for us to see. And the fact that there is no one there to really constrain or provide information that's inconsistent with the way he now sees the world is a really dangerous situation.
And Jim, on that, on the threat?
Yeah, I think just certainly starting with just a general sense, a threat like that you always have to take seriously. And I think coming from Putin particularly, and again, as Andrea said, you know, not only is his irrationality right now give that kind of threat a special believability, or certainly gives you cause to worry about it, but he does. Periodically, he does lay out and mean exactly what he says. So I think given that, and given the place we are right now with him and that irrationality, we have to be concerned about the full range of what that means or could mean, and then take appropriate steps. We can't just mock him and dismiss it. That's been what we've done in the past, over the past 10, 20 years, is to mock things that he says or to underestimate him. Those days are over. We have to take that seriously.
So Jim and Andreas, I want to pick up on something both Jim and Andrea just talked about, which is this notion that we have to take what he says seriously, despite the fact that he lied multiple times, obviously, in the Monday speech, but that he has telegraphed his intentions in ways that we, oftentimes it's kind of like how people talked about Trump after the election, right? There were some who took him seriously but not literally, and some took literally but not seriously, and actually we should take them both. And there were elements of that speech, Jim, that suggested this wasn't about Ukraine going into NATO, right? It was about that the biggest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century that Putin has talked about, which is the collapse of the Soviet Union. It is about getting that sphere of influence and that and their sort of hegemonic territory back together. And implied in that, and I think Andreas sitting in Lithuania knows this all too well, unfortunately, suggested that this could go beyond Ukraine.
Right.
And it could even go to Article 5 countries, the NATO members themselves. It seems highly unlikely, but then many of things that have happened of late have seemed highly unlikely until now. And to your point about his threat on the nuclear front, you can't say that the chances are zero on any of these things. So how do you read that just sort of extraterritoriality move into Article 5 threat, Jim, number one? And also the question that has arisen, I think since Afghanistan, since Trump, and for a while now, since Iraq, is does the United States really stand for what it says it will? And obviously, many have drawn the red line at Article 5 and NATO, and that is absolutely sacrosanct. But I'm not sure that everybody who lives in the Baltics necessarily is putting all of their eggs in that basket. What do you think on that front?
Well, there's a lot in your question, and every one of them is important. In terms of the Baltics, their history has taught them, Finland as well, is don't put all your eggs in a basket that has a hole in the bottom. So yes, I've worked with the Baltics since the earliest days when they were freed from the Soviet Union, and they bring a great deal of skepticism with them. But what I'll say is, and the 2 points. One is we do have to be worried about the gray zone, which is those areas of Europe that are not in NATO. Ukraine has suffered from that, but there's Moldova, there's Georgia, of course, which is invaded too. Sweden and Finland are very concerned about that too. So there's a gray area of instability that we need to now grapple with. But I think what's important in terms of Article 5 and in terms of intent of the alliance and the United States, the military moves that we've made that don't get quite the headlines in terms of sanctions, if you will, that the economic do. They have, and I have spent 35 years in the Pentagon. I know I know about this stuff. The fact that we put F-35s into Europe, the fact that we've deployed Apache helicopters into the Baltic and into Poland, the fact that we got the 18th Airborne Corps now steadily going into Europe and being distributed around. And I think NATO probably at the summit today that they're having, I bet they might agree to deploy the NATO response force as well. The VJTF part of it, the high readiness part of the NATO response force. I think it shows that we're serious. And it shows, including we've been flying B-52s over Europe. They've been going back and forth with the base that we use in the UK to base B-52s. We've done our own nuclear signaling there, and so I think that this is something that is that has not escaped the notice of Putin, and I think that's something that is also, I would hope, in terms of the Baltics. They have been very concerned for years that the U.S. put boots on the ground in the Baltics. And I will tell you, the Pentagon and particularly the Army has pushed back against that because they're stretched pretty thin, and NATO had already put in some battle groups there. What we are seeing now is U.S. boots on the ground in the Baltics, and I don't see them leaving. I think it was elements from the 173rd Airborne out of Italy that they moved up to the Baltics along with the Apaches and the F-35s. I don't see those leaving anytime soon. And so what we're seeing right now in terms of U.S. military movements are things that I never thought I would see in terms of boots on the ground in the Baltics and that type of thing. And I think we're going to see more of those deployments in the next few days. And I say that because Biden kind of hinted at something. There's a carrier strike group in Europe now. I remember when we pulled the last carrier out of the European area back at the end of the Cold War. We got a carrier strike group back in there. The Navy used to say, well, look, we'll provide some Navy presence as we're transiting the Mediterranean going to the Persian Gulf. The Navy's not saying that anymore. So we are showing Putin that there is a military capability, and there is an intent by NATO, including the United States, to fight if they go into an allied country. In a lot of ways, these deployments are tripwires, with Putin understanding that if there's a swipe that they take at Estonia and American troops are killed, there's Article 5, obviously, with NATO that makes a response automatic. But even more important, they've killed U.S. forces, and that brings the United States in one way or another, and certainly quicker than NATO would do in Article 5. So these are very pointed military signaling, including those B-52s, to Putin that he does understand. So I hope that gets to your question.
Yeah, no, it does, and thank you for that. I think, from a practical perspective, much of the corporate world and market participants are obviously very interested in the sanctions. So I want to turn now to my colleague Orson Porter, known to many of you on this call. He runs our Washington office and heads our government affairs practice. So Orson, President Biden yesterday unveiled yet another new round of sanctions, and emphasized time and again how much tougher these were than 2014, and they may be tougher than 2014. The question is, are they tough enough for 2022? And the answer to that seems to be no. I mean, the reality of it is that all of the sanctions that both the U.S., Europe, and other allies and other supporters seem to have been factored in to the Russian calculus, and they certainly don't seem to be doing anything to deter Putin. And indeed, the president himself kind of conceded that point yesterday in his press conference when he, implored reporters to allow these things to take time to have the desired effect on Russia. So, which doesn't help Ukraine in the near term in any way. But how would you kind of characterize what's going on in Washington, both from the White House and congressional perspective, and while we've got you, what are you hearing from companies on this front?
Absolutely, and thanks for having me, Kevin. Let me give you a number that probably matters most in this discussion. 256 days. People are wondering, what the heck is he talking about? Well, 256 days till November 8, Election Day. And that even though this is an international incident, all global politics are increasingly becoming local. And I think, Biden unfortunately has approval rating hovering around 40%. He's been, really dealt a bad hand on a couple issues, like the pandemic, like what we're currently seeing in the Ukraine. The inflation discussion is a primary discussion for voters between now and, as I mentioned, that 256-day window. People, as Kevin, as you always hear me say, where it matters in my home town of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, are not necessarily talking about the Ukraine situation, but they will be talking about the Ukraine situation if the gas prices continue to escalate. So I think, it's really interesting that this week was really supposed to be Biden's big pivot. Today, he made history by, will be making history by nominating first African American to the U.S. woman to the U.S. Supreme Court. He probably thought he would be able to have the opportunity to pivot and talk about rightly how his administration has been able to turn the corner on the COVID discussion, how we've been most importantly able to keep our kids and families safe for the most part and in school. But unfortunately, the State of the Union on Tuesday, I would argue, the highlight from a news perspective won't be COVID, won't be the Supreme Court nomination, won't be the victory lap on the the Build Back Better discussion, won't be a victory lap on the infrastructure bill. He may not have the opportunity to talk about the China bill and the competes bill, et cetera, et cetera. It will be mostly focused, and the media focus will be on his direct response to whatever happens in the next 72 hours in the Ukraine, et cetera. So I think the Senate and the House gave Biden a pass. They've been on break for the last 7 days. Once he gets through his State of the Union speech, I expect for Democrats to really come out swinging, as well as Republicans, on a very, very tough sanctions bill, where I think some of the things that people are complaining that he didn't address, like the SWIFT system, like really going after the banking industry, doubling or tripling the oligarch list of people to go after. And then on the flip side, really talking about spending bills where they can provide additional military support and humanitarian relief. I think ultimately what may happen, unfortunately for the Biden team, is the House and the Senate may be so far ahead of what the White House wants to accomplish that it may put him in an awkward position, and that everything that happens in D.C. really reflects back to the 256 days that I mentioned on Election Day.
And just staying with the sanctions here for just a moment, it seemed like on the high tech front, there's a lot of interest on the high tech front in particular, and they seem to be taking the sort of the Huawei playbook here. Obviously, Russia's not as important a destination for this technology as say China is, but it is also significant that Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea seem to be on board with this as well. But in terms of where they are targeting this, I mean, and what is not being targeted, that would be loosely termed technology, as an example, not being necessarily covered. How do you see it? Where's the line on this, do you think?
I don't think there necessarily will be a defiant line. I think be interesting to hear what Gabe thinks as it relates to, if they're unable to get some of these things like the chips, semiconductor chips from the U.S., then ultimately they would have to turn to China. Then if they do that, then the Congress and the Senate, I'm sure, would find ways to penalize organizations who are making it easier for production to happen in China and for Russians to get. So I think it's all very complicated, and that's an easy one to go after. But ultimately, I think what the Biden team has tried to do is really think about the politics on not affecting the economy as much. Thus, you haven't heard a whole lot of discussion outside of the pipeline on the energy piece. The supply chain discussion, as we all know, is a very complicated discussion here in the U.S., and consumers are feeling the pain. And I think, the Congress as well as the White House are going to be very careful that whatever sanctions that they put out there or constraints that they put for American businesses doesn't have any effect at all or complications on what is already a very troubled market here in the U.S. for consumers to get cars on times and appliances, et cetera, et cetera. So it's all very complicated. That's why it's so easy, unfortunately, to go after oligarchs, to go after Russian banks, et cetera, et cetera. But once you start to really dig deep into that technology piece, that's a supply chain piece, ultimately could affect American consumers, and then that's where things end up in a political discussion in D.C.
All right, so before we move to China, I want to bring in my colleague, Wolf Beakley. Wolf co-runs the Political Risk Advisory group here with me at Teneo. He's calling in from London, and he also heads up our European research. So, Wolf, Orson brought up a kind of two key points here, right? Which is that if sanctions are going to ever work, on whoever they're being applied on. Number one, you've got to have as close to universal imposition as possible. And it's significant, of course, that the second largest economy in the world, China, although I just saw a headline cross that they might be imposing their first sanction on Russia, but generally speaking is not imposing sanctions. Switzerland, where a lot of the money goes through, as we know, not imposing sanctions. But then also, we're not really going for the jugular. The president himself pointed out the differences between the United States potentially and European partners yesterday in imposing sanctions on Russia via SWIFT, right? And certainly we have not gone after the hydrocarbons exports from Russia or the payment for those exports. So why not? Why are we not touching those things?
Because you don't want to leave the European voters in the cold, and you don't want to undermine businesses that is going on between various European countries and Russia. On the energy front, there is a high dependency in terms of gas import for some countries more than others, most notably Germany, Austria, Italy, for example. And for others is less, but the reality here is that the ability to diversify is simply not present. Everybody is feeling the pinch in Europe in terms of inflation and high energy prices, and therefore the leaders decided that is not a price that they're willing to pay. And the same applies to SWIFT. But bottom line here is when we look at the sanction, first they failed, and they will continue to fail. The sanction essentially is a tool done when you want to feel better about being unable to support the Ukrainians. If they succeed, they may succeed long term. And the question here is what's going to be the ability of the Europeans to maintain this sanction in place over time, especially when the winter is basically not that far away and the gas, the ability to provide, to supply gas is somewhat limited. So that is where we are. Most notably, I think, leaving aside the European Union, when we look at even the UK, where Boris Johnson made a big story about the sanction, but the reality here is that nothing has been done about money laundering, and London is the capital of money laundering for the Russian oligarchs. Nothing was done about that yesterday, and as you pointed out, Switzerland so far has not adopted any sanction, even if I expect it is going to come under significant pressure by the EU on this issue. So it's a bit of a mixed bag. And the question that was really missing, European leaders yesterday, they spent hours to discuss about the sanction, whereas I think they should have been thinking more about where Putin is going to eat next. And in my view, that is going to be somewhere in the Balkans, whether it is Bosnia, Montenegro, a mix of the two. We have seen, for example, Serbia already coming out now saying that even if a country aspires to be a member of the European Union, they will not adopt sanctions. So that is the debate that should be taking place in Europe rather than about sanctions.
So I want to ask you though about, obviously going back to what the analogy that Jim made at the beginning about not putting all your eggs in the leaky basket, essentially. One thing that's coming down the pike, one would imagine, is going to be higher defense spending in Europe. And, we're coming out of the economic challenges of the pandemic. We're still coming out of the economic challenges from the financial crisis and the debt crisis in Europe and so on. And we are preparing for the energy transition. And part of the reason we're here where we are today is the squandered opportunity over the last decade plus to diversify the energy mix in energy complex in Europe. But what does this imply for the fiscal situation in Europe, going forward?
There is already debate about continuing with the freeze of the current fiscal rules. So the current fiscal rules were frozen because of COVID. They are supposed to come back into play starting from the budget of 2023 that the European members usually start preparing in now, basically in a couple of weeks. So now there is debate about freezing these rules again to take into account the reality created on the ground by Putin. There is also a looming debate about creating some sort of recovery fund to promote defense spending. something about which Europeans have been very deficient. But also, leaving aside the spending, the key for me is about whether we're going to see the integration of the defense industries in Europe, because the real downer there, the real issue is that we are not able to do economy of scale on the defense front, because each country has been always very reluctant to share whatever they are doing on the defense front. So that would be, in my view, a more important signpost than the spending per se. And having said all of this, without a stronger role of the United States in Europe, this is unlikely to happen anyway.
I want to bring in, and I'm going to warn our audience that we're going to go a bit long here, so bear with us, but there's just a lot of ground to cover. But I want to bring in Gabe Wildow, who's our lead China analyst. And, China has been sort of given mixed messages to a certain degree on this, right? They've given comfort to Putin that they don't want NATO expansion, for instance. But no less a figure than Wang Yi himself, the foreign minister, essentially reiterated China's belief in the sanctity of international borders. There supposedly was this phone call between Xi and Putin in which he implored him to negotiate with Ukraine, though he did not condemn the attack. And now there was one headline that's come across just as Orson was talking, that there might be the first Chinese sanction against Russia. Where do you think China is in all of this?
Well, thanks, Kevin. I think you're right that what we've seen over the last several weeks, and really just over the last 2 days, is a kind of tacking back and forth. China attacking back and forth in its position, attempting to calibrate its positions and calibrate its statements in a way that's somewhat incoherent. And I think the incoherence reflects the fact that Beijing is pursuing basically 3 goals that are in tension with each other, if not completely irreconcilable. And those 3 are, on the one hand, they have this strategic partnership with Russia that they want to support and sustain, and that's based on the kind of shared interest in resisting a kind of U.S.-led world order. Then they have their principle of non-interference that you referenced, Kevin, the sanctity of international borders, that national sovereignty trumps all, and that's very important. That principle is very important to China's own position on Taiwan, to PRC's position on Taiwan. And then third is they want to prevent further damage. China wants to prevent further damage to relations with the West. So it's easy to see why these 3 are in tension and probably can't fundamentally be reconciled. But so what we've then seen in the last few days is a kind of attempt to straddle, attacking back and forth. The readout from the phone call that occurred Friday afternoon, China time, with Putin and Xi, it seems to be an attack back towards the Western position, at least somewhat, compared to earlier statements that were very pro-Russia yesterday and the day before, calling U.S. the culprit, refusing to call Russia's action an invasion, repeating Russian arguments about the expansion of NATO. So I think I see Beijing sort of still struggling to calibrate and formulate in the face of these sort of 3 irreconcilable motivations.
And, a lot has been made of this Russia-China partnership. But it also seems to me that there are a lot of reasons why that might not necessarily have much longevity, right? China needs Russia to be a reliable supplier of raw materials. China, and Russia compete for resources elsewhere, whether it be the Middle East or what have you. They are competing for influence in Central Asia. And since we're talking about going back to historical borders, China and Russia have had historical border disputes as well. And I do wonder, too, when you think back in history to the Korean War being a major catalytic event that woke up the Western powers, that NATO couldn't be just a talking shop. It had to be a militarily robust organization. Can this have a similar effect as we continue to focus, and others continue to focus, on the Indo-Pacific? that, this is going to, again, increase defense spending amongst the Quad states. Maybe South Korea joins and the Quad becomes the Quint. In other words, one day Xi Jinping wakes up and has Putin to thank for an ever more militarized Indo-Pacific, his sphere of influence, ostensibly. What do you think about that future of China-Russia relations?
Yeah, I think you're right that the growing strategic partnership, or the improved bilateral relationship, the dramatic improvement really that we've seen over the last decade. I mean, if you look at China really being very unwilling to support Russia in 2008 in the invasion, with its invasion of Georgia, and then very tepid support for the Crimea action in 2014, compared to what we see today, which at least until Friday, seems very strong tilt towards Russia. But it does reflect a kind of marriage of convenience. It reflects a kind of enemy of my enemy is my friend mentality that does paper over some of the sources of tension. So you mentioned Central Asia. There's a great game going on there. I mean, in January, remember, Putin sent troops to Kazakhstan, and although Russia never spoke out about that, although Beijing never spoke out about that, we can assume that they didn't like it because there is a competition for influence there. There was the Power of Siberia gas deal, which was, by some accounts, an expensive boondoggle that is not profitable now and probably will never be profitable. There were disputes over prices. The two sides value that deal for security reasons, but economically it's probably not viable. And so the question becomes, going forward, how much does this logic of sort of anti-U.S. hegemony, how far can that carry the relationship, or do these other sources of tension, plus the risk that, as you say, by supporting Russia, I mean, I mentioned the three goals that are irreconcilable. I mean, China can't avoid being seen as Russia's enabler if they are seen to continue sort of straddling as they have been, or refusing to condemn, and that will have real costs. Orson talks about the sanctions. I mean, the sanctions we've already seen, let alone other pending sanctions, could affect China as well quite negatively, to the extent that China tries to help Russia deal with, sell the kind of technology goods to Russia, especially semiconductors. To the extent that Chinese companies try to meet that need for Russia, they could then fall afoul of this foreign direct product rule that Biden has invoked, the Huawei template that he's applied to China, and so there are that he's now applied to Russia that originated with China and with Huawei. So there are real risks to China going too far in its support of Russia. They could find themselves isolated, and my guess is that they're still inside Zhongnanhai. They're still trying to figure out exactly how to balance those goals.
I want to turn now to Ria Sears. Ria, thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. She is a senior advisor. She's been on this call before. She's a senior advisor to Teneo. She's amongst the rest of her background. What's relevant for today's call is that she's the former deputy associate director for policy at the National Security Agency, which is the main signals intelligence agency of the United States, and she's the co-author of a book appropriately and relevantly titled Cyber Warfare. I guess, in addition to the sanctions, Ria, the other big concern that a lot of corporates have is with regards to cybersecurity in general, but right now, obviously, because Russia has been such the perpetrator of cyber attacks and hacks in the past. And I guess the first question I have for you is one of motive. Like right now, in the midst of what is going on, what do you think about the possibility of Russian or Russian proxy attacks, outside of the Ukraine or outside of the sort of the theater of battle, to the United States, to United States critical infrastructure, to United States corporate or financial targets and the like? Is there a heightened risk of all of that right now, or is that a constant that is that's sort of unaffected by the war itself?
I would say it's a heightened risk, and I say it not necessarily because of intentional targeting by Russia at this time, but some other second level effects. And The first one is the fact that there could be spillover caused by Russian cyber attacks utilizing malicious software. We've seen it before. Actually, the NotPetya malware in 2017 first targeted Ukraine, and then it spread. It caused hundreds of millions of dollars in business losses in many sectors, which is another part of the concern, from shipping to hospitals. When we talk about potential attacks against the U.S., we have to consider the potential for escalation. And Russia has had no issue attacking critical infrastructure in certain places, Ukraine, Estonia, Georgia. The question is whether it would do so in the West. So there are no norms or red lines in cyber, and some people would also say that there's no deterrence either at this point. President Biden made it clear that critical infrastructure attacks would be crossing that line. Has Russia done its own contingency planning against U.S. or Western targets, including mapping networks and attack plans? Yes, they have. But they are not the only ones with contingency plans. They are already aware of U.S. offensive cyber capabilities. And that question is that a deterrent? And the answer is we still don't know that. The U.S. has also been very aggressive in attributing Russian attacks to Moscow, moving much more quickly than usual on pulling back that curtain. And people wonder whether that would serve as a potent deterrent. I would be hesitant to view it that way, but it also will depend on the impact of U.S. and NATO response and the Russian calculation on whether sanctions deserve a response. What I really worry about is something that you already alluded to, and that is Russia's cyber proxies. They're so-called patriotic hackers and cyber criminals that it utilizes to its own advantage. And once that Pandora is out of the box, what limits will Russia realistically put on these non-state actors? Remember that they've done very little to counter cyber criminals, not just because they need the capital from crime, but because cyber criminals are this force that they can leverage against foreign targets in any number of ways. And it also helps the Russian regime at least have some temporary plausible deniability, which it can then use for disinformation. The last thing I'll add in terms of adversaries is I have to remind you that others will use the cover of Russian attacks to launch their own cyber intrusions. And by adversaries, I mean states like China, Iran, North Korea, and non-state proxies working in collaboration with China, Iran, and North Korea. So a lot of businesses have received a lot of information recently. And the first main thing has been prepare yourself. I would add a few things to that. Please do not rely on probable indicators to move to your highest level of preparation in terms of cyber defense. It's not too late to prepare, although time is running out. And if there's any silver lining in the terrible situation we find ourselves, it's that the level of collaboration between the public and private sectors right now, sharing important guidance, specific preparatory actions, and updated intelligence, and this is huge, really seems unprecedented to me. So it's the one good thing to come out of the crisis, and I think it'll help in preparation, but there's no way to predict either spillover or intentional attacks. Although I will say the Russians are very much aware of what the U.S. can do in terms of its own offensive cyber activity. But that's an escalation that I think we can imagine will cause us significant difficulties.
Has it been, and I know you and I have talked about this a little bit in past calls, but have you, famously President Biden in his meeting with President Putin kind of indicated where the red line was in terms of critical infrastructure. And so what's always implied in that is that, well, then that means everything on the other side of that is sort of not fair game, but it's not going to get us a retaliation that's going to hurt us, essentially. Is that what Russia has essentially taken to heart?
I'm not sure. I also think there's a certain level of signaling before you get to the red line. And I think that's some of the discussion that has gone on in public and private forums on this issue. I really see this more as what Russia can use in terms of its cyber utilities, and it obviously has some significant cyber power. What that will implicate for them in terms of potential blowback, and then finally widening the conflict in such a way that it's not just Russia versus the US, it's also Russia versus the West. And that, despite Russian cyber power, is going to get complicated for them very quickly.
And my final question for you is, you mentioned sort of one of the silver linings was this public-private partnership working, as we've headed toward this. And were you speaking then with regards to the United States and United States agencies and companies, or was this also true? Are you also seeing that in places like Europe and in Japan and other places? In other words, places where American corporations have a lot of interconnectivity and would be victimized or what have you by any attack on those places as well.
Well, I'll give you an example. There's a couple of pieces of malware that people became very interested in because they thought the Russians were going to use them against the Ukraine. And there was a lot of guidance given out by the US, the UK, Asian cyber agencies across the board, consistent guidance, consistent fixes. It's really a very notable joint campaign. It's not just US. And it's very much based on this model now of the necessity for resilience. So I think that's the prime piece of it. But this collaborative, I mean, I'm not overselling it. I personally am a bit shocked at how collaborative it is. And I think it's fantastic. You know, there's this saying that you should, always take full advantage of a crisis. In cybersecurity, that means that for once, you're not talking about if this happens, you're talking about being prepared if this happens. And that's a big sea change here.
Great. Thank you. Well, I know this has been a marathon that's felt like a sprint. So we're going to wind up with energy, which I know is has been a critical side element of this whole story all along. And I want to turn to my colleague, Emily Stromquist. She's the managing director here at Teneo with a strong energy background. And I want to ask, sort of start with the near-term issues here. I mean, we were reminded just in the last 2 days, sort of uncomfortably, as we've seen Russian gas exports to Europe actually spike up, about why we're in such a challenging position in terms of dealing with Russia. But in terms of the dislocations to energy markets and the like here in the immediate term, the optionality that Europe has had, LNG, all of that. How would you characterize the situation now?
Yeah, so I think, a lot of the speakers today touched on the fact that, especially where energy markets tie in, there's a lot of exogenous factors here that, the Russia-Ukraine conflict has certainly influenced prices in the last day or two, thinking on how to diversify, but there's a lot that hadn't changed sort of before all of this happened and is now sort of coming together with a number of other factors. So I think right now the big issues for oil and gas markets are, there's a concern obviously about potential pipeline disruptions that can always happen as a casualty of war. There's also the concern about, insurance and potential risks just to exports around the Black Sea and from Russia. And I think that's as well having, some impact on the prices and hence the reason we've seen them jumping around a bit. But, as you mentioned, there's been some great surprises, I think, on the gas market for a lot of people. And that, stems from the fact that, there's a delay in how Russian contracts are priced. So basically, we're seeing now these long-term contracts that a lot of the European players hold with Russia actually posting much better prices over the next couple months than, LNG imports. And I think this is really going to push Europeans to think more long-term strategically about how do we diversify that. Russia has tons of excess pipeline capacity that's not getting used right now. LNG prices are bouncing around all over the place. There's steep competition, obviously, between Asian buyers and Europe. So there's really this push now to rethink, long-term, obviously that's renewables over the next couple of years. That's how do we get other LNG suppliers into this market. On the oil side, I think there's several interesting things, just kind of a confluence of factors. The Russia-Ukraine conflict obviously sent prices skyrocketing for a moment. Biden spoke, they went back down. But I think the big thing, and Orson touched on this as well, there's obviously a lot of politics in play in this at the moment. There's talk about an SPR release that would be coordinated with Japan, Australia, and the US. That's obviously on the US side a huge concern about, the voters and the price at the pump at the moment. There's the looming OPEC Plus meeting to look at April quotas that's happening on March 2nd. And then there's also the issue of, sanctions are still obviously a concern. Obviously, they're not looking to target right now the oil and gas sector, but, I think there is still that uncertainty about, can, these barrels actually get placed in the market coming out of Russia. And then obviously the big one right now is Iran and, the negotiations right now on a potential nuclear deal. So I think all of this is spooking the market a bit. We're seeing the prices fly around quite a lot. The Russians are probably going to have some problems placing, Urals crude into the market. We've seen, India pick up some barrels, but there is obviously a big political sort of optics issue right now about buying, Russian oil and gas. And I think that's particularly weighing more on the oil side.
So for you, and maybe this is also a question for Wolf, I mean, obviously the big story, the big story going forward is energy transition globally, right? And that's one of the things we've been talking about. But we've also been talking about the requirements to meet national and COP26 targets and all of this, all by 2030 and so on and so forth. But here we are, it's almost March. European gas demand will go down as winter ends. But you know what? They've got to figure something out before next winter. So what's going to happen so that we don't wind up, if this turns into a very prolonged or frozen conflict, essentially the contours of a new Cold War with Russia, how do we prevent this type of a situation next year? Or are Europeans just going to have to deal with higher energy prices, slightly colder, houses?
I mean, I'm a bit of a skeptic in the sense I don't see a solution before next year. I think, Russia has tons of pipeline capacity. They've made it clear they want to be a reliable supplier. This is important to Europe. It's also important to China, who's looking at, Russia's actions in the European market and, assessing, are they actually, someone that we can lean on for additional gas supplies if that were a possibility. So I think across the board, Russia's worried about optics. They have tons of flexibility in their contract prices. They've always been, had the potential to be able to lower their prices on these contracts. So I think, I don't see an option that sort of significantly moves away from Russia over the next couple of years. And, furthermore, they control actual storage in Europe. So, there's a lot that needs to be diversified still. Obviously, there is a push to look at other suppliers and take sort of additional volumes from the US, from Qatar. But these are things that, again, you have to look at capacity and infrastructure in Europe and how you move that to sort of more vulnerable Central Eastern European markets.
Yeah, Wolf, I'm going to give the final word to you.
No, it's absolutely no. I agree with Emily on that, and I think what the debate in Europe is going to be about how green gas is, how green nuclear is, and how green coal is. Meaning, in Germany, we have already seen the CDU pushing to expand the lifespan of the last 3 nuclear reactors in Germany. They are supposed to basically be shut down by the end of this year. In Italy, Mario Draghi today mentioned about reopening some of the coal plants. And in France, all of this happening goes more and more in favor of Macron's plan to build more nuclear power facilities. So it's the debate will get more political, and I think the list of things that are considered green will expand considerably as well.
So basically, coal, gas, and nuclear are all greener today than they were a week ago, essentially. All right. I think we've gone way over. I want to wrap it up here. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. I can't overemphasize what has happened here. The map of Europe is being redrawn by force, which basically undermines the post-war system, the post-war norms that we have lived under. And so there's going to be more on this going forward. We'll see how things transpire over the weekend, and as events warrant, we'll put together more of these calls. So meanwhile, I want to thank Andrea Kendall-Taylor and Jim Townsend, Andreas Tursa, Wolf Piccoli, Gabe Wildow, Emily Stromquist, Orson Porter, and Rhea Sears for joining me today, and for all of you All the best for the weekend. I'm Kevin Kajiwara in New York. Thank you.